Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Impact of COVID-19 on Energy Economics and Sustainability. We are grateful to our moderator and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website located at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have any questions for the panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window and type your question. We kindly ask that you do not send your questions by email. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of the webinar to read and answer your questions. And now I'd like to hand things over to Professor Gurkan, who will lead us through today's webinar. Gurkan?
Thank you, Dave. I want to welcome all attendees to this panel on the impacts of the coronavirus on energy economics and sustainability. We've chosen April 22nd because it's a very meaningful date to discuss this topic. Today marks 50 years of Earth Day. Every year on April 22nd, Earth Day marks the anniversary of the birth of the modern environmental movement since 1970. It is marked every year as a day of action to change human behavior and create global, regional, national, and local policy changes. I would like to introduce today's panel as our contribution to Earth Day. Our panel includes 3 experts, which I will introduce very briefly. You'll see Isabella Ruble on the lower corner. She's a PhD economist and senior researcher at the US Department of Energy in Washington, D.C. Prior to this appointment, she was an associate professor in economics and held faculty positions at various universities worldwide. Then we have Shabnam Shaheen, whom you see next to me on the screen. She's a PhD economist with over 15 years experience in international development institutions such as the UNDP, World Bank, OECD, and IFPRI. She's founder and president of the Socioeconomic Research Applications and Projects, an economic research consultancy based in Washington, D.C. And finally, we have Dr. Edward Salzberg, who is the executive director of the Security and Sustainability Forum and director of professional education at George Washington University Institute of Environmental and Energy Management. Actually, we're working together with Ed there in the same institute nowadays. The format of today's panel is as follows. Each speaker will have a presentation of maximum 10 minutes, which leaves us at the end of the presentations for the panel a discussion time of at least 15 minutes. And after the panel discussion, we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A from the attendees. So with this introduction, I would like to pass the floor to Isabella for her presentation. Isabella, please.
Good morning, everyone. I will be talking about COVID-19 and the US nuclear power sector. So the great lockdown that is due to the spreading of the COVID-19 virus led to the worst downturn since the Great Recession in 2009. And many countries experience a near standstill in many sectors of their economy. And this is due to travel bans, stay-at-home orders, business closures, plant closures that are sometimes due to employees being infected by COVID-19. And we see disrupted supply chains as well. So this pandemic is, of course, affecting growth worldwide. And so the IMF has recently revised its economic growth forecast for 2020. The new forecast for world economic growth is now minus 3% for this year. For the US, it will be minus 6% almost. The EU minus 7%, China around plus 1%. What you see in the brackets here are the original forecasts that were done for 2020 before the COVID-19 pandemic. So nuclear power accounts for about 20% of electricity generation in the US and for 55% of emissions-free electricity, the remaining 45% coming from wind, hydro, solar, and geothermal. And nuclear is also the only carbon-free energy source that can provide electricity around the clock, and it accounted for 28.6% of global emissions-free generation in 2018 and 10% of power generation worldwide. Now this map shows that 30 states have commercially operated nuclear power plants, and these states are shown in green on the map, and the little blue dots indicate the location of the nuclear power plants. So 12 states generate more than 30% of their electricity from nuclear. And for three states, this share is higher than 50% actually. And these states are New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Illinois, with Illinois actually having the largest output of electricity provided by nuclear power plants in terms of megawatt hours. So in terms of nuclear reactors worldwide, there is 442 nuclear reactors operating worldwide. And on the left-hand side here, we can see where those reactors are operating. We see that 96 of those are operating in the US. So the highest number is in the US. And then we have followed by France and China. On the right-hand side, we see the currently operating reactors by supplier country. And we see that, again, the US is leading with 144 reactors and is followed by Russia and France. So when we look at capacity additions, the situation looks quite a bit different. So there are currently 52 reactors under construction, which are shown on the left-hand side of the slide. Most of these new reactors will be built in China and India, and the US only comes in at on the sixth place. On the right-hand side, we see the supplier countries. And again, the US only comes in on the fifth place, and Russia and China are leading in terms of suppliers in this area. Now, next I want to talk about prices, regulations, and support programs. Electricity prices have been declining since 2005, and this is mainly due to a drop in demand, a drop in natural gas prices, and a failure of the markets to recognize the clean nuclear energy. In states with vertically integrated electricity markets, nuclear power plants are typically protected from high price fluctuations. A number of states have implemented support programs for nuclear power to make up for unrecovered costs. Those states are New York, Illinois, Connecticut, New Jersey, Ohio, and recently Virginia. All those states have recognized nuclear energy as a clean, carbon-free resource. The programs actually vary in structure and timing, and in the particular way the support is done. So nuclear power plants have been designated as critical infrastructure by the Department of Homeland Security because the continued operation is important for electricity supply. And so nuclear power plant employees are considered essential workers. And during this crisis, actually, there is two important factors that I would like to mention. And so one is the licensing. And there is the possibility of exemptions for licensed operator physicals and biannual requalification training. And there's also the possibility to extend the due date for 90 days after the public health emergency has been lifted, or until December 31st, 2020. So although nuclear power plants, when they are in operation, have a 100% capacity factor, in 2019, plants on average ran at a 93.4% capacity factor, and that's because of refueling operations. So refueling operations are typically done every 18 to 24 months. And at that point, power plants bring in 100 to 200 specialized workers. And the operation of the plant has to stop completely for 2 to 4 weeks. So for the spring of 2020, 32 nuclear power plants in 21 states have planned to undergo refueling outages, and some of those outages are already underway. The industry, of course, has concerns with the pandemic, and so essential workers, for example, typically come from all over the US, and they stay in hotels and eat in restaurants. And so with the travel restrictions and the closures of restaurants and hotels, that becomes really difficult. So that's one of the concerns the industry has voiced. Also, the access to personal protective equipment and medical protective equipment that is in short supply is a concern, as well as the COVID-19 testing. In some plants, actually, some employees have already tested positive for the COVID-19, and the industry has reacted very aggressively to contain the problem, and so far, this has worked very well. Additional problems constitute the product orders, that product orders are delayed or canceled, and that can be due to reduced economic activity or supply chain disruptions. Industry electricity demand has decreased, and the workforce availability due to the pandemic is constrained. So this slide shows an example for the PJM power market, which covers around 13 states. And it compares the load shapes for March 2020 to March 2019 or earlier years. And we can see that the morning ramp up is occurring later than before, shifting from about 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. even. And there's changes in the evening peak that is about 5% lower than before. The overall curve is also flatter with less fluctuations for morning and evening peaks. And these changes are more pronounced with increased measures to mitigate the pandemic. So as you have more social distancing measures, more school and office closures, etc., we see a bigger effect. In general, electricity loads have declined by 5 to 15% with very large regional fluctuations. So to conclude, what are the implications in the medium term and long term? The effects of the pandemic on the nuclear power sector will really depend on how fast the economy recovers, but there could be some lasting effects in the power sector in general. So there could be an effect on the load shape. The change in the load shape could persist. There could be a change in energy usage, depending how that will persist, depending on how different sectors are affected by the current crisis. There could be a remaining change in the energy fuel mix. And finally, depending on what priorities countries will give to emissions goals coming out of this crisis, investment for climate change and clean energy projects might also suffer. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me.
Thank you very much, Isabella, for this presentation. We will continue with the Q&A session at the very end. So I would like all three presentations to be finished, and then we have the panel discussion and then the questions from the attendees. But the attendees are encouraged to type their questions and send meanwhile. So I would like to invite now Şebnem Şahin for her presentation. Şebnem, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Today I will talk to you about policy considerations in oil importing countries facing COVID crisis. So my research is part of my projects for different development agencies like UNDP, World Bank, and so on. So I'm looking at the short-term impact of COVID and starting from a disruption of global and regional trade. Three oil importing countries that I picked are Afghanistan, Jordan, and Turkey because they are part of these development programs. I'm talking about an economy-wide modeling approach, which differs a little bit from Isabella's presentation. So I'm trying to link the energy sector, energy outputs and inputs to sustainability and the rest of the economy. Because the crisis originated in China and it had a ripple effect in the global economy, I chose a multi-country framework, a general equilibrium framework, which is called Global Trade Analysis Project, a very well-known framework, which is multi-region, multi-sector, which covers more than 122 countries, to which we also added Afghanistan during our project. And we also updated the database from 2014 to 2018. So more details can be found on the GTAB webpage about this model. So I'm again approaching from an economy-wide perspective. Economy-wide perspective is represented in this figure, where the rectangles are different economic agents. So you are represented as households or as part of government. Isabella will be one of them, businesses, researchers, and the rest of the world, the other countries. So in a normal situation, as you can see, there are agents and they are exchanging between others. So each arrow is an exchange between one agent and the other. We have two circles, as you can see. We have an inner circle and outer circle. The inner circle is the domestic economy. For example, the household will spend its money on goods and services provided by the businesses. And in return, in the bottom arrow, the businesses will pay the workers, again the household, wages and salaries. So this is the normal flow of the circular economy in non-crisis periods. But facing COVID-19, as you can see, there are different red crosses. So these interactions are disrupted. The most important from my approach is the upper layer, the international demand shocks, which are also translated into domestic supply shocks, which are also stopping the businesses from producing. They may go bankrupt, as you see in the figure. And if they are bankrupt, they cannot pay the household, the workers, which in return may cause a financial sector crisis. So I think this is a good snapshot of the economic situation for my countries when the COVID-19 hit. So these are global assessment, early assessment. I won't spend too much time on that because Isabella already mentioned it, that globally, we are looking at a recession in 2020. And depending on the institution, the rebound will come either quickly in 2021 or a little bit later. So in the middle of a crisis, it's very difficult to understand how deep is the crisis. So most of the time, economists look to the history. So these bars, the 4 bars, are different crises that the world experienced. And here it's a chart from International Monetary Fund looking at the Asia region specifically. So starting with the oil shock in 70s, there was also an Asian financial crisis, 2008 global financial crisis that I also chose as a reference. But according to the International Monetary Fund, the COVID-19 will be the deepest one. And looking at this orange lines, we can also imagine how fast was the recovery after these shocks. So if it is a V shape, immediate deep and immediate rebound of the economy, or it is taking a little bit longer. So I also wanted to show this as a reference because in my countries, we experience different simulations, how the country will recover from the shock as well. Otherwise, here's a summary of what I used the model for different countries, these 3 different countries. I looked at the decline in global trade. First, a big decline. And here my reference is 2008 economic crisis. And a smaller decline, which is also almost half of it, where only 7% of the global trade is declining. I looked at 2 types of oil price scenarios, and I will need to, of course, rework them now, because in both scenarios, the prices were positive. Gürkan will talk to us about the current situation, I'm sure. So the low oil price scenario was the situation where the barrel will be for around $24. So it is half of 2019 in 2020. And in constant price scenario, I thought that, in 2020, maybe 2019 average around $60 US per barrel could be the case. And I ran the simulations for these countries and came up with these numbers. So why these numbers are important? Because the policymakers need to have a reference how to prepare for the current expenditures to contain the disease and how in the aftermath of the disease they will recover from this shock. So we are looking at a summary of the simulations for different countries. Initial conditions are in the middle column. So the oil prices are the main component. They are low compared to their level in 2019, almost 40% less than previous year. For Afghanistan, I also added a socioeconomic shock, which has Afghans returned from Iran. Why I did this? Because it's a socioeconomic phenomenon, another shock to the country. 150,000 people are returning from Iran. And also, as you can imagine, there are also suspects to bring the disease from Iran to Afghanistan. So how to help these people and how to take care of their health condition was a problem. On the right-hand side column, I'm summarizing the simulations. So the B scenario is the big trade shock. The A scenario is a smaller trade shock, and the C scenario is just to think that regionally the trade is impacted. So what would it mean for Afghanistan? Afghanistan's exports to and from Pakistan, Iran, India, Kazakhstan, its main trade partner, is diminishing by 8% or 25%. So these were the numbers that were projected by the government. So I kept the same numbers for Jordan and Turkey. Of course, this time the main trade partners is European Union. So if you start with the most pessimistic scenario, if it's a global trade shock, as deep as in 2008, the Afghanistan GDP is likely to go down by 14%. In Jordan, it's around 10% and around 4% for Turkey. If this is a smaller trade shock, Afghanistan is likely to lose 8% of its GDP, Jordan around 5%, and Turkey around 2% of its GDP. If it's a regionalized shock for Afghanistan, we are looking at between 5% and 17% of GDP loss. around 1% loss for Jordan, between 2 and 3% loss for Turkey. So again, these are the heads up for policymakers who are looking at recovering from the shock. Now we have to link it to, of course, the oil prices impact and sustainability. Here I'm also taking my country as an example for convenience. I'm looking at the most pessimistic scenario, the big decline in global trade. And I'm looking at these two oil price scenarios, the low oil price scenario and the constant price scenario. Prices are like in 2019. So please pay attention to these charts, and GDP is on the right-hand side, but the composition of GDP is on the left-hand side. There are 5 other blocks. So as you can see for the imports, the second one from the left, in the dark green bar, the imports are higher than pre-corona situation or higher price in oil situation. So what it means, with low oil prices, Turkey starts to import more oil, refined oil and crude oil. And if you compare it to investment, investment is also higher for the low oil price scenario. Why? Because knowing the Turkish economy, most of our imports, almost 80%, refer to intermediate consumption goods. Importing also oil products that are also translated in the production system. They are not for final consumption. And in the production, through investment, we are attempted to produce more. So it's a positive impact of oil prices, even in this crisis scenario. So now look at a little bit in detail to which sectors are most impacted. So here we are looking at the COVID with the big shock on global trade. And we have 2 columns looking at the higher price scenario like prices in 2019, or on the left-hand side, lower prices scenarios like the prices are much less than in 2019. So in the low price scenarios, the energy industries, mainly refineries, they double their activities, 104%. In transport, there's also 1% increase. The rest of the economy, manufacturing, construction, agriculture, services, they are losing. So the overall GDP impact is that we are looking at, and we already mentioned it, is around 4%. In the higher price scenario, the energy industries are increasing, but just a little bit. Transport is suffering naturally. Other sectors are also suffering in agriculture and services sectors because of the trade shock, not in this case because of the oil prices shock. So what does it mean in terms of sustainability? Let me give you a bit of background that Turkey is 20th largest emitter of GHGs. And the main responsible sector, unfortunately, is the energy producing sector, with 41% of emissions coming from this sector. So still Turkey is a modernizing country, but the energy sector is a little bit archaic and depends mainly on fossil fuels. So as you can see in this bars, again, the dark green bar for energy industries, they are doubling their activities, hence they are doubling their CO2 emissions. And this translates to total emissions also to increase with respect to pre-virus scenario and then higher oil price scenario. So this is not a good signal from sustainability point of view. And here I'm talking about another country because in Turkey, I don't have plans. I'm not aware if there exists how to recover from COVID-19. Here's from my Afghanistan country case. The government came up with a budget amount of 250 million to contain the virus's dissemination and then to recover from the immediate impact of COVID-19. So here I ran the model to come up with different funding solutions for the government. So if there's a switch from expenditure in public services, from other sectors towards health, for example, from defense and education towards health, we are looking at around 1% loss of GDP for the government because they don't have the capacity to generate new revenues in the immediate term. If the government can raise money, and if there's no interest on this money, there are mostly grants, they can slightly increase their GDP. But if they invest on regional correlation, and if you will remember, the biggest impacts are from the GDP loss from the regional trade reduction, they may increase their GDP around 2%. But in this case, I don't have the sustainability component. These activities or financing is not earmarked to any activity, but it is very important, and it's part of our recommendations to the government to keep sustainability in mind in the recovery phase. So I don't want to conclude. I would like to have an open discussion with you and the participants. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Şebnem. Very interesting numbers you've presented here, and your sustainability aspect puts a very timely transition to our next speaker, Ed, who will focus more on the sustainability aspects. Ed, please go ahead.
Ended on, I think I just got unmuted. So thank you, and I appreciate the previous speakers. And Şebnem, I really appreciate the fact you ended on sustainability, where I'm going to pick that up. Görkem mentioned that I work with him at GW on energy and sustainability courses. And I also run the Security and Sustainability Forum, and we have a lot of free education that if you go up to the website right over here, you'd be able to take advantage of it. I committed to talk about sustainability and the virus and where we might go from here. There's a lot to go over, and my talk has three parts: a quick review of how we got to this vulnerable state, concepts of resilience lifted from the current enterprise resilience course that we're offering right now, taught by resilience pioneer Joseph Fiscal, and then the competing concepts of a monetary economy versus an ecological economy, which really kind of ties together where we are and where we might be. The virus has brought clear to society that we are at a crossroads. One path leads to a continuation of instability and degradation of natural resources and overall inequality really across the globe. And the other can be a pathway to more resilience and really something just the opposite. But let me start with the problem and the solution, which is energy. It's the essential driver of the natural world. It enables us to live. It's even more fundamental to our overall society than we might even think. Nothing happens without it. Discovering fire gave early humans more security and protected the small tribes from their environment. Social systems are defined by the energy system. That means the size and the tenor of the population. Wood could support small tribes of people that had to migrate to areas of new fuel sources, never depleting any area. The tribes were in balance with their environment. As we discovered denser and more transportable fuels, society could sustain larger populations, and we needed them to supply the demand for a workforce to take advantage of the petroleum that was able to drive a new kind of economy. Fossil fuels enabled a new social structure to evolve, one based on organization to provide goods and services that benefit society as a whole. So on the one hand, fossil fuel is really great. It drives public health. We're more secure. There's more food. We can travel around the world. But on the other hand, it has its own externalities that are not a problem in itself, because the real problem is us. And I think I hit the wrong button and slipped ahead here. Sorry about that. Okay. So fossil fuels enabled the development of public health, food, environments, and it really insulated us from our former natural enemies, lions and tigers. They're no longer a threat. But because there were no natural controls in our population, we grew exponentially. But everything on the planet has to come into balance at some point. Our ecological footprint has grown to the point that we crowd out fellow inhabitants, and stress the carrying capacity of the Earth, not because of our numbers in themselves, but because of our disregard for the contribution of nature to our well-being. We outstrip the supply of clean water, for example, and degrade estuaries' ability for fish to spawn. Mathis Wagernackle, who's going to be on a webinar with us in about 2 weeks, founder of the Global Footprint Network, publishes an inventory of how much of the world's regenerative capacity humans use each year. It's a single measure of how fast we consume resources and generate waste compared to how fast nature can absorb our waste and generate new resources. Needless to say, we're at a large deficit each year. That means the regenerative power of the Earth is degrading. And our impact, humanity's impact on the environment, hits all areas of the environment: wetlands, lost forests, plastic in the seas, toxics dumped into wastewater. Meanwhile, the financial impacts of natural disasters keep growing as more and more people and property are exposed, especially along coastlines. The global cost of disasters in 2018 was estimated at $155 billion, much of it in the United States. Our focus on bottom line profits, resisting rational policies such as banning single-use plastics, citing dubious public health concerns, come at a great cost to the planet, a cost that's not considered in our economic equations. The bottom line focus on profits should be replaced by the embrace of the triple line bottom line of people, planet, and profit. And a fourth piece cited by C.B. Bhattacharya from the University of Pittsburgh of purpose, the question of why we do what we do. It's really a question of values. Defining a sense of purpose should lead companies and governments to realize that business belongs to society and not the other way around. When the covers come off and a country needs to face an epidemic, it's those poorly paid workers that contribute the real value to society, and not the corporate CEOs so much. The virus may actually be Mother Nature's way of hitting back at a species that takes more of its share of natural resources and throws the world's equilibrium, the Earth's equilibrium, out of balance. Today, we're facing turbulence and volatility and unprecedented numbers. Major disasters, natural or man-made, can occur unexpectedly. Even minor incidents, such as a local power failure, can cause significant financial losses. The complexity that has evolved has led the World's Economic Forum Global Risk Report to shift from trying to quantify specific risks to portraying the network of interdependencies among those risks. The diagram shows color-coded diamond shapes. The size of the diamond reflects their judgment about the significance of the risk. Notice how almost everything is interconnected. For example, disagreements over climate change can contribute to global governance failure, which combined with political and social instability can lead to fiscal crises. When disruptions are often unknowable and unforeseen, risk assessment becomes impossible, and traditional risk management practices aren't really adequate. Hence, the WEF calls for a resilience imperative. So really, we need to go beyond the concept of sustainability, which is being in maybe harmony with your environment, to a more resilient system, which enables you to recover and bounce back, not necessarily to the same system, which is not necessarily protective of moving forward, but to a more resilient, more sustainable state of being. Typically, business and community operations are designed for stability and predictability, essentially resisting change, and in simpler times this worked well, resulting in greater operational efficiencies, higher yields, and of course cost savings. But it turns out that optimizing for efficiency can actually remove buffers that protect against uncertainty. Iowa, which is great at growing corn, if it only grew corn and nothing else, and it supplied the world with corn, one epidemic could wipe out the corn, and we're not able to recover from that. So Iowa is not sustainable. It's not resilient if it's just a one crop economy. Likewise in Venezuela, which really depends upon its oil exports. When prices drop, the economy drops along with it. So it's the distribution, it's the distributed nature of local economies, the stratification of those economies that really protect it. Efficiency increases profits, minimizes economic waste, but it exposes systems to events that it can't recover from. So resilience and efficiency can very often be opposite sides of the equation. Translating the strategy to business and communities implies more localization than globalization, if you think about those long supply chains. And it would mean encouraging a certain level of redundancy in services and inventories as opposed to the radical streamlining of our supply chains. That means increasing prices in some cases, but the opportunity costs of not doing that are really severe. I'm going to just kind of slip through this one. There are other impacts on society too, which have to do with equity and what happens with poorer nations. We export our jobs, our lower paying jobs in many cases to outside of the United States, speaking just for the United States. But we also export our pollution to those countries as well. Economic inequality increases both within nations and among nations. And as regions specialize, there's an overall lack of diversity, and adjusting to black swan events really becomes very, very difficult. So let me just define resilience as we do in the course. And this is Joseph Fiscal's definition. The definition of resilience is the capacity of living systems to survive, adapt, and flourish in the face of turbulent change. It means the ability to cope with the more profound changes in the business and natural environment. Our address of the environment and our address of business practices and the need to adapt and bounce forward by improving competitive posture, making them more sustainable in the long run. And there's a long list of companies that have prospered tremendously for a short period but failed to evolve. Think about the early digital competitors in the business computing industries such as Digital Equipment, Sun Microsystems, and others, where IBM is one of the few survivors from that time. So resilience and the ability to adjust to and embrace change is really important, but it's only part of the answer. Values and how we account for the various contributions to the well-being of society is the other. Here's how the world actually works, but only part of it is captured by the gross national product. This is a concept of ecological economist and futurist Hazel Henderson. At the top is the contribution of the business sector. It's clearly easy to manage. It's easy to capture by gross domestic product or the way we calculate gross domestic product. It's supported by the contribution by the public sector, which can also be calculated. Amazon couldn't exist, for example, if there were no public roads and airports. What isn't counted in what Hazel calls the love economy, people that take the low-wage jobs and the free work done by grandparents and volunteers that go unmeasured, but enable the corporate contribution to exist. The GDP rests on the contributions of Mother Nature also in its regenerative power. All of this is exposed in the pandemic, where the love economy becomes much more important. Changing the way GDP is calculated to include all four contributions would change our assignment of values to segments of the society that really contribute much more than we recognize, an ecological economy. So finally, to the crossroads. We, at least in the United States, are a monetary economy. It's taken us far, but the virus has clearly laid threadbare the notion that markets will fix all of this. We can continue on this path once we do figure out the virus and get ourselves into a stable public health situation. But if we do, we continue on a pathway of continued degradation of the earth, inequality, and instability. Resilience based on systems thinking and an ecological economy bring us to a more resilient and equitable society, and I maintain much more sustainable. That doesn't mean we don't bring money and profits into it, but if it's our only measure, leads to instability, which I believe we're proving every day in our global economic system. Well, let me, and these are concepts that we cover all the time in the series that in the forum. So if you're interested, there's lots of free education up there. But let me just end on a more positive note. The good news is that Mother Nature is incredibly, exceedingly resilient, and it does values all contributions to its systems. The virus enabled many species to thrive in the absence of humans invading their habitats. I saw deer in my backyard last week for the first time in several years. The example here of endangered species like these turtles in Brazil thriving because the beaches are not being used is just a good example of what nature can do in a fairly short period of time. So let me end just by saying that as bad as we've made things, we do have the chance to turn it around if we can get our policies and programs to really value the actual contributions to our GDP and calculate them in a way that we can quantify the value of those contributions. And let me just end there. I think I kept it to 10 minutes, Gurkan. I hope I did.
Thank you very much, Ed. I think it's a very nice ending of the presentation with the good news and with the food for thought for changing the way GDP is calculated. This has been in discussion for many years, but maybe this pandemic will change now the way of thinking for this and trigger new developments. Now, I would like to continue with the discussion on resilience. With the good news, nature can change itself. I wonder what now the mankind can do in terms of technology. So towards a more resilient structure. And let's start with Isabella with the question on the technology part. Actually, Isabella, in your presentation, you pointed out the technological change towards probably smaller systems. There was one slide there. And I know the small modular reactors are also now a new development in the United States kicking in. So I want to expand this, not only the nuclear reactors, but also like all distributed generation technologies, which probably in times of a pandemic are more reliable and sustainable, probably more resilient. So is this now the new way to go? Do you see distributed generations technologies kicking in? What is the economics there?
Thank you, Gurkan, for the question. So at the moment, there are several technologies under review by the the Nuclear Regulatory Council, that is a federal entity. Of course, the pandemic could trigger a bigger interest and possibility of more investment. What we see in terms of profitability and so the micro reactors in theory, because right now they're not yet in use, commercially. So in theory, they are profitable, and they present a few advantages compared to the big nuclear power plants, which is really that, for example, the refueling that is going on right now in some bigger plants will only have to happen every 10 to 15 years instead of every 18 to 24 months, which is the case for the big nuclear power plants. So they also need a smaller operating staff, and they have more flexibility in terms of ramping up or, decreasing, the power supply.
Thank you, Isabella. Actually, I would like to combine this round with the Q&A from the attendees, and I see there are lots of questions coming in, about a dozen now, and there is one question in particular related to the technological choices you've provided. It says, why does gas jeopardize nuclear, given that nuclear is likely to the left in the merit order?
Yes, so that comment about nuclear was more meant for the longer term, not for the immediate term.
Okay.
Yes, that's correct. That's maybe I should have been more precise there. Yes.
Thank you, Isabella. So, Shebnem, I'd like to continue with you with the same resilient outlook. In your model link analysis with all the sectors, detailed analysis, do you have a more resilient economic structure prescription for the countries? I mean, you have presented Jordan, Afghanistan, and results for Turkey, also for OECD countries in general. And would your studies would it be possible to easily and in a short time frame repeat those studies for other countries? What are the requirements in terms of data and time there?
Sure, it is possible, and I'm getting many requests from different countries, even Papua New Guinea, asking for assessment of COVID impact in their island. So, of course, with some expertise from the countries, and if there's data in the economic structure, input-output matrix is the main component of these models. It is possible to update it quickly and come up with similar studies. Again, it speaks to the policymaker. So it will depend on their requests and their programs to be developed. For the resilience case, yes, first of all, the Afghanistan, the last slide was talking about how to generate finances to fund immediate emergency actions and beyond. So first of all, we can have this exercise with using the model, having some reserve money for disasters. It can be a health disaster, natural disasters, or oil shock, maybe a spike in oil prices. I don't know, you are the expert. So for the long-term resilience, Ed also touched upon bringing the supply chain closer to the country, closer in the sense that with the countries they have more affinities, more trust in accommodating the input requirements from these countries, or maybe regionalization, like it's the case in South Asia. They are more and more talking about feeding each other in between India and Nepal and Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, and so on. So it will create resilience in the long term. First of all, emergency resilience with some reserve money, how we generate it, we can look at it using the model, and in the long term, having this more resilient supply chain. It's very important.
Yes, thank you, Shebnem. So, Ed, I would like to continue with you here, actually, with the impact on renewable energy technologies in terms of sustainable technologies when we're talking, particularly now what the coronavirus has done with the oil prices. How does this affect now investment in renewable energy technologies? This question even came in before the panel from a potential attendee from Nepal. So please let us know what you think.
Well, I think you've got to take a look at the short-term impact versus the longer-term impact.
So
whether there's enough demand
longer-term
destruction
impact,
for
I would
oil.
say. How do we make it work for the renewable energy technologies, which are now not as competitive anymore when compared to natural gas and fossil fuel prices that have collapsed.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be difficult to attract investment into renewables when they're not as competitive. So I think that all of the data that I've seen, especially things like investments in energy efficiency, they really depend upon, for building energy efficiency, they depend upon subsidies. So the bottom line is still, I think I'm not on mute, is that right? I'm speaking. So I think that renewables, or at least for a period of time, are going to run into problems. On the other hand, in the long term, the sustainability of continuing to invest in technologies that do degrade the planet, and I put natural gas in there as well. Methane is a terrible greenhouse gas emitter. Unless we can get a price on that and get it into a policy where you can levelize the actual impact that the different technologies have on the functioning of the world and the functioning of society, there's going to be a skew, economically skewed to the lower price solutions. But I think there has to be a tipping point here because of the impacts, the environmental impacts on populations, and many of those impacts are really severe, and they cause the droughts that are being caused in certain parts of the country, the flooding that's being caused, tying that back to emissions. When that finally is all pulled into the equation, I think that the investment in renewables will have to pick back up again. When that tipping point happens, I'm not sure, but we need to be talking about it all the time and trying to get policies in place that are much more supportive of investments in those directions.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the list of questions, trying to combine them, and there is one cross-cutting question here. Now that many businesses are on the brink of going bankrupt, the finance packages to revive businesses. Now, sorry, I lost the question. To revive businesses and economies may be a key tool to restructure economies to be more sustainable in the future. Do you see an opportunity here? What should be done? So we have discussed this partly in terms of technology, and this question goes to all of you, to the panel in general. So the opportunities here for a more resilient, sustainable future, to restructure the economies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Who would like to go? Şebnem, maybe you've done. Actually, there is another question asking for the tourism sector in Turkey, if this is in your analysis included.
Yes, I was typing the answers.
Okay.
Yes, the tourism is included. In this presentation, I chose to present the sectors according to UNFCCC classification, which is much more aggregate, because I was talking about emissions and so on, but I could have presented according to the model classification, which is around 57 sectors. So tourism is in it. Turkey is hit on the tourism side, as well as Jordan. So they are suffering from the same phenomenon. How to make it resilient, and Ed touched upon it. What can I say? Diversify the economy. So having alternative livelihoods for the people in the really regional and ground level, and for the economy having also diverse sources of income. And the third one is this trade war. Of course, it's also on the background affecting the global economy. So how to position yourself, your country, not to have disruptions in the future in terms of imports and exports. This is very, very important.
Right. And I would also add to that and say that localization is, I think it's clear now that localization is really important. I mean, globalization has its place, but localization of the economy is really important. So the dollars spent stay in that economy rather than get pulled out. So large box stores like Amazon and Walmart that pull dollars outside of that economy are really in dynamic tension with keeping the local businesses together. I know in my town in Falls Church, Virginia, we're investing in the in the businesses here. The Economic Development Authority and the city itself are putting dollars behind the small businesses to get, in addition to what the federal government is doing, to get them through this period of time, because we're in this together with a larger global company that's not really part of the community. They're not in it with you as much as your neighbors are. So I think that localization, and I think, Sebna, that is what you're talking about when you talk about diversification of the economy within that local unit, is just really critical to add stability there.
Ed, just one more thing. You're addressing all this in more detail in your courses and in your forum, right?
That's correct. Joseph's course really goes into how to apply systems thinking to develop a resilient program. It's a terrific course, I have to say. And then the forum, we convene global experts from all over the world. So Hazel Henderson, if you're interested in that layer cake, we're doing a multi-part series with her starting on the 6th. Mathis is on one of those, and Francis Moore Lappy, who wrote the book on Diet for a Small Planet, a lot of folks like that, to talk about where we can go from here from a standpoint of resilience and ecological services, valuing ecological services overall.
Yeah.
Long answer to your short question.
Thank you, thank you. So we're running out of time. Isabella, I would like to give a final word to you in the closure with all the how to make it resilient and more sustainable. I think we've gone over all the solutions in a broad manner, so details can be taken up later in further courses, etc., whatever. So Isabella, what's your final takeaway here?
I think I leave that to you, Gurkan, right now.
Okay, so as a final word closure, and there is a huge set of questions which we cannot answer in all one by one here in the panel, but I would like to encourage the panelists to type in their answers to the people who ask, because we are running out of time. My final takeaway here is that we need to change the way we think. The future shall not be the same economic structure as we experienced in the past, and we need to change the way we've been calculating GDP, what Ed presented. And then like localization and sectoral developments, technological developments, to build a more resilient, sustainable structure for the future, for the mankind. And this is on the Earth Day an important message, I think. Now we're finished actually with time. We're overrunning now. So I would like to close this panel, and as a final word, for those who are not IAEE members, I would like to encourage to get on the IAEE website, check out the services, products and services, and become member of this wonderful worldwide organization where David Williams, Executive Director, has presented a brief overview at the very beginning of this webinar. This webinar will be available afterwards. For those who have missed certain parts, there were questions on that, to just enter and follow the webinar once again, and the slides will also be made available. So thank you very much for all attendees for taking the time. And thank you very much for the valuable panelists for their wonderful presentations and insights. Stay healthy, stay safe.
Thanks, Gurkan, for pulling all of this together.